Um, the issue of accommodating refugees is a challenge faced by many places around the world. As large numbers of refugees arrive over an extended period of time, the problem has become increasingly serious. The social resources required to take in refugees have risen sharply, greatly increasing the burden on citizens of host countries. Moreover, some refugees, due to differences in lifestyle and culture, struggle to integrate into society, and in some cases, even commit intolerable crimes. This has fueled growing anti-refugee sentiment within communities. This situation caught my attention. As someone who enjoys thinking about such issues, I decided to explore it further. This video presents the conclusions I've reached on the matter, along with a few possible solutions I've thought of. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I am Eric, a cat who loved to think. I like to solve difficult questions. Here is the place I share and discuss my solution for the problems. The main goal of this channel is to find solutions, so I hope everyone can set aside their personal stance in order to listen and engage in meaningful discussion. This is all about my channel. Let's start to talk about today's topic. The large-scale and prolonged influx of refugees has gradually turned refugee accommodation into a serious social issue. Citizens of host countries have faced a sharp increase in the use of social resources by refugees. In addition, some refugees have committed intolerable crimes, and due to differences in lifestyle and culture, host populations have developed growing anti-refugee sentiments. As for why this issue of hosting refugees arises, I believe there are three main reasons. First, the asylum system gives refugees the privilege of choosing which country to seek asylum in, while host countries have no right to choose whom to accept. Second, the approaches to dealing with refugees are rigid and outdated. Third, deportation is often extremely difficult. I will later explain in detail how each of these three factors contributes to the problem. Is this issue inherently difficult to solve? In my view, it is not. However, there are significant obstacles to finding the solution. Once these obstacles are removed, the problem can be addressed with clarity and relative simplicity. The greatest obstacle comes from those who support immigration, whose arguments are based on several fundamental misunderstandings. These include refusing to acknowledge the flaws that exist within the refugee system, treating human rights as an absolute and dogmatic concept, misusing the term empathy, and oversimplifying positions into two opposing extremes. In this video, I will explain the confusions behind each of these views and discuss how they should be properly understood. Finally, I will explore what steps we should take to effectively resolve this issue. Among the various obstacles, the most serious one is the claim that there are no problems within the refugee system. No matter what issue we are trying to solve, we must first acknowledge that the problem exists. Without recognition, there can be no solution, because it is impossible to fix something we insist does not exist. Therefore, if we truly want to resolve the issue of hosting refugees, we must begin by accepting that the refugee system does indeed have flaws. However, even today, there are still people who support immigration, yet believe that the refugee system is perfectly fine. This means that even when we want to solve the problem, society cannot engage in meaningful discussion to identify and address these flaws, because we remain trapped in an endless debate over whether the problem even exists. In other words, we are stuck at the very first step of problem solving. So, does the refugee system have problems? The answer is yes. But can we clearly identify what those problems are? For many, the answer is no. This leads to a common misunderstanding among some supporters of immigration. The belief that if a problem cannot be clearly described, then it does not exist. This is a flawed way of thinking. It's like feeling unwell but being unable to say exactly what's wrong with your body. Your inability to name the problem does not mean that nothing is wrong. Similarly, when more than a quarter of society feels uneasy about the refugee system, we can reasonably assume that there are indeed underlying issues within it. Another confusion among some who support immigration is that they conflate acknowledging problems in the refugee system with rejecting refugees themselves. They believe that admitting the system has flaws is equivalent to being anti-refugee, and therefore they resist any such acknowledgement. But in reality, many people who recognize that there are issues with the refugee system are not rejecting refugees at all. They simply believe that the system is being misused or exploited by certain individuals for personal gain. Their intention is to patch up these loopholes and prevent abuse, not to deny or oppose refugees. Finally, we must be cautious of what might be called the refugee industry. One reason some people refuse to acknowledge the flaws in the refugee system is that this industry exists, a network of people and businesses profiting from refugees. This includes illegal labor and human trafficking operations. Because these activities are tied to economic interests, those involved have strong incentives to deny that any problems exist within the system, ensuring that their profits remain protected. Another major obstacle is the dogmatization of human rights. The concept of human rights, as we understand it today, is based on moral universalism. The belief that moral principles are universally applicable to all people. However, moral universalism has never been proven to be entirely correct, which raises the question of whether our current understanding of human rights is truly flawless. The evidence of this lies in the fact that human rights contain inaccuracies and that different rights sometimes conflict with one another. The inaccuracy of human rights refers to the inconsistencies in how similar situations are judged under the same principles, and a lack of agreement among individuals when interpreting the same moral issue. One of the most common examples of this problem is the idea of non-discrimination. In practice, people interpret this principle differently depending on who they are and what situation they are in. For example, to prevent discrimination, we are told we must not assume that certain racial groups lack ability in certain fields. Yet, for that same reason, to prevent discrimination, we may be told to give preferential treatment to those very groups in those same fields, because they are perceived as lacking opportunities or capability. Which of these interpretations is the true form of non-discrimination? There is no real consensus, which shows that human rights are not perfectly defined or consistently applied. Furthermore, human rights often come into conflict with one another. For instance, the principle of non-discrimination can clash with the right to freedom of expression. Should we be allowed to point out that certain groups exhibit undesirable behaviors or habits? From the perspective of non-discrimination, doing so could be seen as unacceptable. But from the perspective of free expression, it is a legitimate exercise of speech. How should such conflicts be resolved? There is no clear answer within the current framework of human rights. This once again illustrates that the concept is not entirely flawless or self-consistent. One of the key obstacles we face today is precisely this dogmatization of human rights. Some people believe that human rights are entirely correct and must never be questioned. That all actions and decisions should strictly follow human rights as though they were sacred principles. In doing so, they elevate human rights to the level of religious doctrine. Yet they forget that human rights have never been proven to be completely right or universally valid. Treating them as untouchable dogma creates serious problems. This is exactly what we see in the refugee issue today, because human rights have been treated as beyond question, and because the idea of refugees is embedded within the discourse of human rights, Any attempt to question or reform the refugee system is viewed as a moral transgression. This inability to question means that even when problems are clearly present, we cannot seek improvement. As a result, society finds itself trapped in the very dilemma we are facing now. Unable to discuss, criticize, or repair a flawed system because doing so has been deemed morally forbidden. Another obstacle is the misuse of the term empathy. In discussions about the refugee issue, some supporters of refugees often accuse those who question the system of lacking empathy for refugees, using this accusation to end the debate. This argument appears to place them on an unassailable moral high ground, but in reality, it is an ignorant and shallow form of criticism. To refute such a claim, one only needs to hold up a mirror, because anyone who uses empathy as a weapon in political discussion inevitably commits one of two major errors. The first mistake is failing to apply empathy to all the people involved. For example, in the refugee debate, do these individuals ever extend empathy toward those who oppose refugee policies? It is difficult to argue that they do. If they truly did, they would not accuse others of lacking empathy. Instead, they would attempt to explain why others might think differently. Those who oppose the acceptance of refugees are not necessarily devoid of empathy. Some have indeed applied empathy toward refugees, yet still hold their opposing stance. Consider the case of a poor thief and a shop owner. If you empathize with both parties, you would not conclude that the thief should be unconditionally forgiven. Rather, you would believe that the thief should first be held accountable and then be helped to improve his circumstances. However, if empathy is extended only to the thief, then unconditional forgiveness appears reasonable. The difference lies in the balance and fairness with which empathy is applied. The second mistake is that empathy itself is not a reliable or precise moral tool. The problem with reasoning through empathy is determining whether the conclusions it leads to are actually accurate. Take, for instance, the same example of a poor thief. Why should we assume that the theft was purely driven by hunger and not by a desire to avoid work? In the refugee debate, this translates into the question of how we can be sure that every refugee is fleeing for their life rather than seeking a better standard of living. In reality, a significant number of people who arrive in the UK in a refugee status are doing so to improve their living conditions, not to escape persecution. Some even falsify stories of oppression to gain refugee eligibility. These two errors are nearly unavoidable among those who use empathy as a moral weapon in political discussions. The truth is that empathy is ill-suited to political debate. It may be valuable when dealing with individuals or small groups, but it loses accuracy and meaning when applied to large populations. The larger the group, the less precise empathy becomes because it relies on personal emotion rather than objective assessment. Therefore, applying empathy as a guiding principle in political discourse is a misuse of the concept, a sentimental approach that oversimplifies complex social realities. The final obstacle is the oversimplification of positions into two extremes. Those who support refugees often fall into this pattern of binary thinking. For example, they may assume that anyone who opposes a tyrannical regime must automatically be a supporter of freedom and democracy. However, in reality, tyrannies often persecute individuals simply because their political stances differ, not because they champion democratic ideals. One of the most well-known examples of this is the relationship between Hitler and Stalin. They were fierce opponents of each other's regimes. Yet, both were notorious dictators. If Stalin had been born in Nazi Germany and fled abroad, should we have accepted him as a refugee? Conversely, if Hitler had been born in the Soviet Union and fled for his life, should we have welcomed him as one? These examples expose the danger of reducing complex moral and political situations into overly simple dichotomies. Moreover, This kind of polarization prevents genuine discussion. It mixes together distinct perspectives that should be treated separately and wrongly positions non-opposing ideas as if they were mutually exclusive. In the context of the refugee issue, oversimplification leads people to conflate opposing all refugees with believing that the refugee system has problems. These are not the same view. To oppose all refugees is to reject the very existence of refugees. To believe that the refugee system has problems is to acknowledge the legitimacy of refugees but question how they are currently treated. Confusing these two positions creates a straw man fallacy, where criticism aimed at a small group of people who truly reject all refugees is used to dismiss the much larger group of people who merely wish to improve the system. This confusion obstructs meaningful discussion about the real issues within the refugee system and prevents constructive reform that could actually help more people. A similar problem occurs when opposing boat people and opposing Ukrainian refugees are lumped together as if they represent the same stance. This blurs the focus of the debate, mixing issues that require different responses and complicating matters unnecessarily. By shifting accusations toward areas that do not require urgent attention, the real issues remain unaddressed. The conversation then stagnates at the question of whether something should be done, rather than how it should be done. These obstacles are the main barriers preventing us from properly addressing the refugee accommodation issue. They are the reason why the problem has become so difficult to manage. The flaws within the refugee system itself are, in fact, not so hard to resolve, as I will go on to explain. The problems caused by refugees, or rather the issues within the refugee system itself, can generally be divided into three main types. The first is that the asylum system grants refugees a kind of privilege, the privilege of choosing their host country, while host countries, in turn, lose the right to choose whom they accept. This imbalance has created a series of serious problems, including the continuous influx of boat people into the UK, the difficulty of handling refugees who cannot integrate into local society, and the inability to prevent potentially harmful individuals from entering the host country. The main reason why large numbers of boat people continue to arrive in the UK is that once they reach British territory, they are almost guaranteed the right to remain. Because this reward is certain, they are motivated to risk the journey. For those refugees who struggle to adapt to the host society, the host country has no authority to reject or relocate them, resulting in a situation where both the refugees and the host nation lose out. Furthermore, the lack of mechanisms to prevent the entry of individuals who may pose harm to the host society has created further risks and instability. To effectively manage the refugee issue, the international community could revisit the concept of the first asylum port that emerged during the Vietnamese refugee crisis, but improve and systematize it to handle modern large-scale refugee movements. For example, the idea of a first asylum port should be restructured so that the hosting country is not expected to accept refugees without any form of compensation. Accepting refugees without compensation is, in effect, similar to forced labor. The difference being that one burdens governance rather than individuals. A system of compensated asylum would improve relations between refugees and the local population, while giving international organizations assisting refugees a greater degree of discretionary authority to manage resources and logistics effectively. In addition, clear international standards should be established for closed refugee camps to reduce the risk of human rights abuses. Most of the human rights issues within such camps stem from inadequate facilities and poor treatment of refugees. By setting minimum standards for infrastructure, sanitation, and oversight, these risks can be significantly reduced. Furthermore, managing refugees' expectations is crucial. Host countries should clearly communicate the conditions of their acceptance. Also, resettlement is not guaranteed, and that refugees may be subject to repatriation after a fixed period, such as 10 years. Unrealistic expectations and uncertainty about their long-term prospects are major sources of psychological distress among refugees. Addressing these factors would help mitigate mental health problems and social tensions. Finally, to fund these initiatives, participating countries could be given the right to transfer refugees affected by the same crisis to designated first asylum courts. This would ensure that financial responsibility and humanitarian obligations are more evenly shared across nations, allowing for a more stable and sustainable global refugee management system. The second major issue lies in the rigid and outdated ways of dealing with refugees. To begin with, when we compare the living standards of most refugees in their home countries with even the lowest standard of living in developed host nations, it becomes clear that the majority of refugees previously lived under far poorer conditions. This disparity is one of the reasons the refugee issue has become so complex, as it attracts economic migrants who seek to exploit the refugee system to improve their living conditions. Their misuse of the system has significantly increased its burden, pushing it close to collapse. In truth, there are insufficient deterrents or punishments for those who abuse the refugee system. For instance, there should be stronger penalties for those who falsify their applications or whose claims are rejected. Measures that discourage people from exploiting the process. Moreover, refugees who are, in practice, unwilling to become self-sufficient or who openly reject the core values of their host country should face relocation or deportation. Without consequences, the system remains vulnerable to misuse and loses public trust. Since refugees enjoy, to some extent, the privilege of choosing their host country, they should also bear the responsibility of making appropriate choices. This responsibility should include ensuring that their presence has only a negligible negative impact on the host country. By doing so, the negative perceptions surrounding the refugee system could be reduced, allowing to operate sustainably over the long term. At the same time, deterrence against abuse of the asylum system must be strengthened, particularly by addressing the motivations behind such behavior. In other words, people must be discouraged from misusing the asylum system by ensuring that their desired benefits cannot be obtained through deception. One possible approach could be the introduction of monetary penalties. Those who abuse the system could be fined, and if they cannot repay the amount, they would be required to carry the debt. Since many individuals who exploit the asylum system do so for financial gain or improved living conditions, imprisonment, especially in developed countries, where prison conditions are relatively secure and comfortable, is not an effective deterrent. Financial penalties, however, would both discourage abuse and help offset the losses caused by such misuse. The funds collected could then be reinvested into the refugee system, allowing resources to be redirected toward those who are genuinely in need of protection and assistance. This shift would not only restore fairness and sustainability to the system, but also reaffirm the original humanitarian purpose of asylum. The third major issue is the difficulty of deportation. When it becomes necessary to deport certain individuals, we often face significant obstacles. One major challenge is that the refugee's country of origin may be unwilling to cooperate, or may itself be in an unsafe or unstable state, making deportation impossible. In cases where the home country refuses to cooperate, this usually stems from domestic, social, and economic pressures. In short, a lack of incentive to accept returnees. Typically, those subject to deportation are individuals who pose challenges in some way, such as those unable to support themselves economically or those with criminal backgrounds. For their countries of origin, accepting these people is seen merely as a moral duty, offering no tangible benefits, and often creating additional burdens. From a cost-benefit perspective, Deportation is therefore a losing proposition for the sending country. To make deportation smoother, host countries could offer incentives to countries of origin. For example, the transfer of debts arising from fines imposed on those who abuse the asylum system could be used as a form of inducement. This would create a financial reason for the home country to cooperate, thereby easing the process of deportation. When a country of origin is unsafe or unstable, another possible approach would be to establish holding areas for deportation in safe third countries. The core of the controversy surrounding failed deportation efforts is not the inability to deport individuals per se, but the fact that these individuals remain within and continue to draw resources from the host society. In other words, the public's concern is primarily about continued contact between these individuals and the local community, rather than the technical success of deportation itself. To address this, two conditions must be met. Those awaiting deportation must be separated from the host population, and their use of social resources must be minimized. The only way to achieve both goals is to relocate them to deportation zones situated in third countries. This shift in perspective, from trying to remove individuals from the country to relocating them to a controlled environment elsewhere, could help resolve much of the tension surrounding the issue. Moreover, establishing such deportation zones does not have to be the responsibility of a single nation. It could be accomplished through international cooperation, which would distribute both financial and logistical burdens among several countries, making the system more efficient and sustainable. For these reasons, I believe that the creation of deportation zones in third countries represents a feasible and pragmatic solution to one of the most persistent challenges in refugee management. Finally, when addressing the issue of refugee accommodation, one of the most significant challenges we may face comes from the Human Rights Convention itself. When confronted with such a situation, it is easy to think of a straightforward solution: simply withdrawing from the convention. However, in practice, withdrawing from the Human Rights Convention would encounter tremendous resistance. The main reason for this is that we are not adequately prepared, and we have not yet established either the rationality or the necessity of doing so. To achieve this, I believe we must first accomplish two key tasks. The first task is to establish a theoretical foundation showing that the current Human Rights Convention no longer effectively safeguards human rights. In order to justify withdrawal, we must first identify and demonstrate the unreasonable aspects within the convention itself. As I mentioned earlier when discussing the issue of dogmatized human rights are not necessarily absolute truths. Therefore, it is entirely possible for the Human Rights Convention to contain elements that are irrational or outdated. For example, we might question whether unpaid and involuntary care for others constitutes a form of forced labor. If so, then would unpaid and involuntary care for refugees also qualify as forced labor under this definition? Another example lies in the overly broad interpretation of human rights within the convention. Suppose a person chooses to engage in an act that could have been objectively avoided, but that action results in the loss of a specific human right. Should such an individual still receive full protection under the Human Rights Convention? By identifying these inconsistencies, we not only strengthen the rationale for withdrawal, but also create a framework for protecting human rights domestically after withdrawal. In other words, recognizing where the convention fails can guide us in designing new national mechanisms that ensure people's rights continue to be protected, even outside of the convention's framework. The second task is to formally request amendments to the Human Rights Convention, thereby establishing the necessity of withdrawal. This step is quite straightforward. Since the convention contains unreasonable elements, we should make a good faith attempt to reform it. Doing so allows us to shift our position from that of utilitarian actors, leaving the convention simply because it is disadvantageous, to that of defenders of human rights, who withdraw precisely because the convention has become inconsistent with its own principles. This change in perspective is crucial. It reduces the potential economic, legal, political, and diplomatic costs associated with leaving the convention, and it reframes withdrawal as a principled act of reform rather than rejection. Essentially, if the convention could be successfully amended, withdrawal would no longer be necessary. But if amendment proves impossible, we would then have clearly established the necessity of withdrawal, and would therefore possess both the moral and practical grounds to do so. Once these two steps are completed, much of the opposition to leaving the Human Rights Convention would naturally fade. In fact, it might even give rise to a growing movement advocating for withdrawal, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of renewal to reestablish a more just and realistic framework for human rights. These, then, are my personal reflections on the refugee accommodation issue, and the solutions I believe could lead us towards a fairer, more sustainable approach to handling it. That's all for this video. Thank you for your watching. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Every like, subscribe, and comment are a contribution to solving those difficult questions. For comments, please remember to follow the rules outlined in the description to help maintain a healthy and respectful discussion environment. I look forward to your joining our discussion and making a contribution to solving the difficult questions. Once again, thank you for your watching. Goodbye.